Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream. On the last day of May 2022, I've got the year right again. That's two shows in a row. That's not bad, is it? Great to have you on board tonight, and good to see you all in the chat. As normal, I'll just go through my brief introduction. Just to remind you, we don't provide financial or legal advice on the channel, just a general conversation. I am moderating the chat, so please be careful of that. This is recorded on the 31st of May 2022, and if you want to get my attention, use that Walk the World. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means that you can get your questions top of the list or indeed make a contribution to what we do here. Always greatly appreciated. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to bring Damien in. Damien, hello.
Martin, how you going?
Yeah, pretty good. How are you doing?
Oh, not too bad, not too bad. It is very cold in Melbourne as well.
It's an icy blast from the south, isn't it?
Yes.
And I know you've been battling with flu and COVID and all sorts of things, so I really appreciate your coming on today and sharing a bit of your time with us. It is greatly appreciated because there's a lot to talk about, really. There's so much going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I'll apologise in advance for my voice. And my warning for people is don't get COVID and then flu shortly afterwards.
No. Yes, yeah. It's unfortunate when they come in sort of serial, right?
Yeah, that's right. And all the kids' schools at the moment are just just cesspits of disease.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the interesting question, of course, is trying to make sense of these markets at the moment, right? There are so many different cross currents, so many things going on, and hopefully we can talk a little bit today about some of those dynamics, where it might be heading, what are the things that you're looking at. And it is worth just highlighting the ASX was down a bit today, although the markets in the US last Friday were up, and in fact on Europe they were up yesterday. Big debate about have we hit the bottom, or is this a sort of a bit of a dead cat bounce where it comes back? What are the things to read? How are you reading it at the moment?
Yeah, look, so it's always there's always two decisions, isn't there? One to get out, and then the next one, just as important, is when to get back in. So markets, obviously, international markets, I think have obviously been more affected in terms of price wise, came off quite substantially. And then, but we're in this little bit of a bounce at the moment, and I think a bit of it's been driven really by the thought that maybe the Fed won't be as hawkish as what people had at first thought, and I guess that's probably giving a little bit of hope to some people. On the flip side is within any market correction, when you're seeing markets fall, you will often see pretty big rises, and then it'll drift back down again, and I do think that's probably where we are. I think from a valuation perspective, the froth has been knocked off the market. So when we look at sort of valuation multiples, it's no longer historically expensive. So if I use the US market as an example, about 16.5 times price to earnings price to next year's earnings is a reasonable sort of long-term average. We sort of got up in the low 20s for the last sort of 18 months or so, and now we're back down to that sort of 16.5. So from that perspective, from valuation, you're at least knowing you're buying it at sort of longer term averages. The big issue is always what earnings are doing. So the actual valuations, if you just went out there and said, I'm only going to buy when the markets are cheaper than average, and then I'm going to sell when the markets are more expensive, is actually not that good of a strategy, because what tends to happen is when earnings growth is about to be really good, markets get a bit expensive, and then the earnings, so using those examples, the earnings might get to 18 times, but then earnings go up by 10%, and that sort of brings that 18 times back down to back closer to 16. And so now you're, so a lot of it is about trying to work out the forward earnings. And I guess from that perspective, that's where I do have some concerns. And, if we're looking at the Fed needing to keep on raising rates in order to squash energy prices, then, you're talking about, 10, 20% downside probably to earnings at least under those scenarios.
And the point you make there about forward earnings, clearly one of the things you have to do then is to factor in what you think the interest rates will be ahead. because the interest rate fundamentally will determine what discount you use for future earnings.
Yeah, that's right. But even more importantly, I guess it's that right now is the part about it. If interest rates go where interest rate markets are pricing them, say in Australia, you 7% mortgage rates. We're talking about a recession in Australia, and that's going to really hit earnings. And so it's sort of that double effect of going, okay, how high are they going to go before central banks start to pull back? How much damage are they going to do? Because if they do too much damage, then you're going to see a much bigger earnings effect. And so, yeah, there's obviously a lot of things at play. And we every time we're here, it's in my contract with you, I think, that I have to mention that we're in the hands of central governments, and it's not an ordinary market, and policy error is our biggest risk, and that's what we're how big will the policy error be? It's really
we've said that right the way through this last few months, and it was just worth reflecting. This is the current 30-day interbank cash futures trajectory, and what they've done is basically brought a lot of the increases forward, and then basically 2.5-3%, and then going flat. So that's quite a different trajectory from even a month or two ago. And it's interesting that if you look at some of the yield curves, what they've now done is they've come off their tops, particularly the 3-year curve. I might put one of those up in a second, which suggests that some people are now saying, well, hang on a moment, maybe the acceleration of interest rates might go quite fast, but then actually top out perhaps before what people were saying. And of course, Westpac is saying, it probably won't be more than a couple of percent. CBA, I think, quite similar. Others are saying, no, it could be a lot higher. And of course, the forward implied rate from the market is more than 3%. Yeah,
absolutely. And which puts us at 7% ish in terms of mortgage rates.
Yep.
So, and I think, all the calculations we've done on that, and you've probably got more granular data, is that there's a significant proportion of the Australian economy who cannot handle interest rates at those levels.
Absolutely.
And they'll be forced sellers, and that's going to crash the housing market and unemployment and all these other things like that.
Well, let me show you this chart. This is one that I produced a little while ago, which shows you that off the baseline of 1.5 million in stress at the moment, for each 0.5%, you get about another 150,000 people falling into mortgage stress, So if you put rates up 2 or 3%, then you're looking at 400 to 500,000 additional people getting into cash flow difficulty. They're not all going to default, but it's going to have a huge economic impact on people's inability to spend simply because they won't have the money.
Yeah, and actually, what's the amount that are already in?
Well, 1.5 million.
1.5 million, right.
So it's 43% at the moment. It goes up to 47 or 48% if rates go as the way the market is suggesting. So, and then the other point is, again, looking at the stress data, not only have you got the interest rate momentum, but you've also got the inflation momentum, the cost of everything else. And I look at it in cash flow terms, not just in terms of servicing the mortgage, which is more broad than a lot of the other analysts to look at it. They just look at it servicing the mortgage. I look at it in total cash flow for the household.
So is that a good segue into energy prices then?
I think it could well be, Damien, because I wanted to ask you specifically about that, right? I did make a show on it the other day, and of course, energy prices are going up. Actually, who's being milked is my question.
Yeah, there's a pretty reasonable argument that this is war profiteering. I mean, that's the argument they've made in the UK. Is it's war profiteering, and so they need a super profits tax in order to make sure that you haven't got energy companies basically benefiting at the cost of the rest of society, and paying the reaping all the benefits and of Putin's war, and so Australia to date seems to be ruling out having to do any have any effect, and I think there's probably two big elements. And when I say Australia as well, let me be clear. What I'm talking about is East Coast Australia. West Coast Australia has a gas reservation. And I've spoken about that on this show in the past, is that they're talking about, I don't know, $5 a gigajoule, whereas 30, 40, 50, pick a number. There's hundreds of dollars that you can get, I think, in terms of some estimates, in various regions. So, I guess what I'm saying is that the gas price anyway is 10%-ish of what the East Coast gas is. And, a lot of that comes back to the East Coast is open to the rest of the world, trades openly. The companies made very strong representations to the governments of the day that you didn't need gas reservation on the East Coast because we had so much gas that we'd never have the situation that we're currently in. There's been there's talk about, do we need import terminals, and it's crazy. We're the world's biggest exporter, and discussion about whether we should be putting import terminals to buy our own gas back. It's just it's a monumental policy error, I guess, and we've talked about it in the past. What we talked about in the past, I thought was really bad. This is 10 times worse. Yep. And so you probably so ballpark. So that's the gas. The other one is coal that doesn't get probably mentioned enough as well. Is that the coal prices are extremely high as well. So they've sort of gone from $50 ish a ton to sort of $400 a ton. Now we don't have coal reservation, and it's a but having said that, it's not something. It's not outside the realm of what would happen in other countries, is to slap an extra tax on to say, okay, well, let's make sure that we're that Australia is one of the world's biggest exporters of coal, is not paying more for coal than all these countries that we're exporting it to, and that we're getting it at a cheap rate to reflect the fact that it's our coal. There's been, I think the New South Wales government is looking at doing some subsidies and things like that for consumers, which, great for trying to help, but effectively all that's doing is throwing more government money into the pockets of these, resource producers, rather than saying, let's slap a tax, or let's put gas reservation on there to make sure that locals can get the gas at the right prices. If we're going to subsidise them, we're effectively encouraging them to add more to the price, which is effectively what seems to have been done. So big price shock coming. You're probably talking about doubling, I guess, of the average power bills and gas bills at the moment, based on sort of current levels. I don't think it has to be that way. It's but I guess it's speak to your local members. There is in terms of gas, we have a mechanism to it's already in legislation. They just need to enact it. But it's not happening at the moment.
Well, it's interesting if you look. I think it's something like 60 to 80 billion of taxpayer money goes into the resource sector, right? Yeah. So we're actually already throwing money at them, right, to basically then allow them to invest and mine and produce it, ship it overseas, but in the process they can charge us more ourselves. The whole process is back to front.
Absolutely, and we're just about to kill the rest of our manufacturing sector in the East Coast.
Yeah, exactly.
So anyone. I mean, in Europe, basically, Europe's facing similar prices to Australia. So we've effectively got European gas prices here. Is the fertilizer companies are just literally shutting down and saying, well, we can't see a future for this production. So it's better that it gets done in the US or in somewhere like Western Australia, where they have gas reservation and they have cheap gas. Let it be done over there and out of Europe. And that's what we're going to see in East Coast Australia effectively, as well, as saying, well, we haven't got gas reservation, anything like that. Let's send it to WA. Let's send it to the US. Send it to Middle East, anywhere with cheap gas prices. They can keep doing that. And we've locked ourselves as the world's biggest exporter. We've locked ourselves out of cheap gas prices. Yeah,
major policy. Yeah. But now, on the electricity, it occurs to me that if you are fortunate enough to be able to afford roof panels and batteries, you can actually keep your costs down relative to those who can't afford it, right? So we're actually creating a very street society. Those who can and those who can't afford to get with the solar.
Yeah. So now this is a silver lining on the cloud, is that I've called it before Putin's carbon tax, and effectively it is like, so what's happened in terms of prices is we've all of a sudden made renewable energy dramatically better as an alternative. Because if we're going to double, well, in the case of gas prices, they're up 6 times. In terms of electricity prices, it's not quite 6 times, but it's not far off. So I think, and what that does is that just makes renewables, which were already looking pretty good, it just shoots them into the category of no-brainer. But as you said, you need a big upfront cost.
Yep.
And so, and there's, obviously lots of renters and things like that as well. And so renters can't put the solar panels on, so they'll pay the high prices. Anyone with solar panels, if you haven't already got a battery, I'd be starting to price it up, because if current prices are in any way, shape or form going to be in place for a couple of years, your payback period on batteries is going to be really, really good. Far better now than what it was. The big problem we're seeing in Europe is that you just can't get all this stuff on fast enough now. Like, there's just not the production capacity. So in my mind, we've moved forward the whole renewable shift by about 5 years at the moment, just in terms of and you just see announcement after announcement in Europe about things they're doing to accelerate this whole process. And they've obviously, they want to get off Russian gas. They're talking about, every single government property will be having solar panels and batteries. They're talking about making it every new property, has to sort of prove that you can't put a solar panel on, as opposed to, so, from that perspective, we've sort of been trying to work out the how fast can you set up these solar panel production, because that's your main limiting factor at the moment, is solar panel production and your battery production. Now, it's going to take a while. It's not, it's not going to be a sort of 1 year or a 2 year process, but it's very snowballing. So if you go out and now get enough solar panels to produce, say, 1% of Europeans' electricity needs next year, and then you go and build another 1% the year after, well, now we're producing 2% every year. And then you go and add another 1%, now 3%. And in 10 years' time, you're basically saying, hey, well, now we're producing 10% of Europeans. We're removing that from the by producing all these solar panels and installing. And so that process, I guess, is a non-linear process, and it's going to go slowly right now, and it will be hard to see the effects, but in 5 to 10 years' time, it's going to turn quite dramatically. I guess it's going to quite dramatically accelerate, and you're going to see a lot of power taken off. So in terms of all the energy calculations, you're making some fantastic profits now in energy companies, but you've cut 5 to 10 years off their lifetime, and so trying to weigh up when does it all finish and all that type of stuff is very difficult. Yeah.
And the AGL thing, which happened this week, is quite interesting, isn't it? In terms of they were trying to separate the old from the new, as it were, and they failed with that.
Yeah, that's right. Look, the tough thing with all this electricity stuff going on at the moment is this idea that there's people out there who have bought assets, and there's rapid changes going on to electricity networks, and a lot of those people want their money for the assets they pay. So think about it the way we had all these taxis, and people would pay these top dollar for taxi licenses, and then Uber comes along, and everyone who paid top dollar for a taxi license has all got their hand out asking to be compensated. And so the big question for me for a lot of these is, will they be compensated? Now, given a lot of them are international companies, a lot of them bought these things knowing that there's climate changes exists, and there's these things happen. My personal perspective would be no. You made a mistake, that's your bad luck. But they've got lobbyists and they pay big donations to political parties, and so maybe some of them will be bailed out. well, not maybe, it seems likely, I guess some of them will at least partly bailed out. And so getting those calculations right as to how much support you're going to get from governments, how much you're going to be left to sort of carry the value of these assets on your own, and then how much can you leverage existing assets into the new future and of more and more renewable energy is a big question. So I look at AGL and there's so many uncertainties, and at the stroke of a pen, a new energy minister could effectively make it a great investment, or at the stroke of a pen he can make it a terrible investment, and it's very hard to work out where it's all going to sit.
And when it actually comes back to money, power, and lobby, and the power of lobbying, which is what it is, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I don't know how you can possibly quantify it, because you don't know what the lobbying processes are behind the scenes and how it might play out.
Yeah, and then the next step, obviously, we've hit this stage now where energy prices are about to double. The public opinion towards energy is not going to be positive, but so does it turn into, no, we don't want to throw any more money at this, we're already throwing lots of money at it? Or does it turn a bit like the stage we got to with job keepers and job seekers and all that type of stuff? Is like, well, we've already flushed 50 billion, what's another 10 billion? Or we've already flushed 70 billion, just add more into the pile, and the numbers become a bit meaningless. Very difficult to tell.
Absolutely. Well, that's certainly very concerning. And when I look at my household surveys, the things that are coming through are significantly higher costs of energy, petrol, those sorts of things, right? School fees, other things, but then just basic costs of food, and the cost down the supermarket is a big factor for many people, particularly again those on lower incomes. There was a report that came out overnight from the UK. They've done some analysis specifically looking at lower cost staples, and their conclusion was that those actually at the lower levels of the income range are much more exposed to these sorts of costs. Sorry.
So it's really interesting, the whole food production one, because on one side we've got these the gas issue, in that elevated gas is a key input into fertilizer costs, and fertilizer costs are getting so high that the question is, for a lot of farmers, is it worth actually spending the extra money on fertilizer? And if they don't spend that extra money on fertilizer, they'll have much lower yields. But they're weighing it off and going, well, I produced 1,000 and I have to spend this money, or do I produce 800 and not have to spend that money? Actually, it might be better for me to produce 800 because it's going to cost me more than what I'm going to make. And so that looks like that's real, and it's going to probably come into play. On the flip side, a lot of it really does come down to weather, and one of the I saw some estimates in terms of wheat the other day, and they're looking at maybe losing half the Ukrainian crop for wheat, but actually there could easily be more wheat produced than what there was the year earlier, because Canada's bouncing back and it's got a big amount, and there's a couple of other countries in there that were going to produce more than what they're expecting. So it's a I guess where I'm getting to in that, it's very hard to work out where all the substitutions happen, because what will happen as well is people who are choosing to feed animals will choose the cheapest feedstock, and what that means is you do get a lot of substitution. So I'm fully expecting there will be food shortages based on the amount of fertilizer that's sort of being lost and the cost there, but I'm not positive which crops it's going to be in. As I said, as I spoke about wheat there, where it looks like there might actually be more wheat than pre-Ukraine, but it's probably going to show up in, there'll be other crops where people have planted more wheat, say in Canada, because they're expecting issues with the Ukraine, and that's meant they haven't planted as much soy or something else. That will hit emerging markets worse than developed markets. So it tends to be that the costs really aren't that high for a developed country. So I think we're talking about I think the numbers say for a loaf of bread might be like 30 cents or something like that, or lower, in terms of the amount of cost that you have to spend for those raw materials. Most of it's really in the packaging and all this other part to it. But that's not to say that that's not what, we're not getting rises in packaging costs. We're not getting rises in shipping costs. We're not getting rises in wages. And so, I guess what I'm coming back to is those costs are all flowing through. I don't look at the food costs and necessarily say that's going to be a terrible thing for developed markets. It's going to be very bad for emerging markets where the cost of food is much higher as a percentage. But I'm more worried about I'm more worried about things like energy costs and transport costs and things like that, actually sort of pushing prices higher than I am the raw food cost as much.
Well, it is interesting. So 2 observations. Firstly, the UK has now announced that they're going to allow GM crops in the UK. When they were part of the Eurozone, they couldn't because that was banned in the Eurozone, but they've now turned turtle on that. And in fact, Jason asked a little while ago, with the fertiliser shortage, perhaps we should just go GM. So, there's an angle there, and that's one of the reasons why the UK is doing it. The other interesting thing was that at Davos, there was a very strong set of discussions about the critical issues with regard to food and food poverty, and how that going over the next few years, this is probably one of the biggest issues that we've got internationally. 400 million people are probably at the sort of the starvation level even now, and more coming. And that's partly to do with the situation with Ukraine. But the point was, it was already happening. We're already getting this rise in commodities and rise in wheat even before Ukraine started. And so one of the things that came out when I was looking at what they said, that this was already the trap was already being laid before the Ukraine thing happened.
Yeah, and Brazil's had years of droughts, and Brazil's a huge exporter of a lot of food products. And I think you can sort of track a lot of these to go, well, has it been good weather in Brazil? Good, and if so, then there's often we've got plenty of food around, and then we've had a couple of bad years or a couple of rains at the wrong time or whatever, and a country like Brazil and US, Canada as well, very much. That can really swing things around in terms of in terms of those costs. I think though, I guess it's worth remembering though that at least the food sector is used to this type of. It's a lot more resilient than other supply chains.
Right.
So we've seen, say, the supply chains with cars in terms of, okay, all these parts get produced somewhere, and so when there's problems there, and Shanghai produces all this stuff. When Shanghai shuts down, nobody can build whatever they can build from that, and so it's very concentrated and streamlined, and it all got down to that sort of very much just in time. Whereas the food distribution is used to it being, hey, there's a flood in India and they've lost all their wheat and we need to bring wheat from elsewhere, or something's happened in China and there's a big disease and we've had to wipe out all these pigs, and so there's that stuff happens every year, and so sometimes you get a sort of a unique sort of confluence event where it all happens at once, but there is a fair bit of flex and a fair bit more resilience within that chain, but the fertilizer price is affecting everyone. Yep. And so that's the sort of unavoidable part. And so praying for good weather would offset most of what's happening in the Ukraine without too much of a worry. But you get bad weather and the Ukraine and other stuff happening at once, and then that's sort of, again, just all sorts of problems.
I should make the point that I'm not a great believer or supporter of what Davos normally is up to, and particularly the shot of all the hundreds of airlines all sitting there parked, they all flew in on their private jets, but the particular debates that they had around food and food poverty was actually, to me, quite an important debate, because it really did highlight the complexity of it, and two, the fact there are no simple answers.
No, that's right. And I mean, the last time we had food shortages and problems was effectively the when we saw the Arab Springs sort of jumped up, and so that is well worth noting that when you get food insecurity, it doesn't really affect developed countries very much, but it really does hit the so if we're short wheat and there's 5% less wheat around, what tends to happen is you'll pay an extra 20, 30 cents for your loaf of bread, and so will people in the US and all that type of stuff. They won't care, which means the people that don't get the bread are in these emerging markets, yep. and that often ends up in geopolitical instability.
Yeah, and Sri Lanka is an example. It's already happening.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Now, Ray asked an interesting question, which was this: would organic farmers see more profits since they use less artificial chemicals? Interesting take on it.
I don't know. Yeah, maybe. I guess if you're not using fertilizer, though, if you're not using the fertilizer in the first place, then you make. Yeah, maybe you make more of the crop. If the crops are priced higher, maybe you make some more.
So generally, it used to be the case that organic crops were actually, you could sell them at a premium, but I'm not sure what the equilibrium is between the premium versus the lower yields.
Yeah,
don't know.
That's right. Well, I guess my overall thing on farming is you just want to have a decent season when everyone else is having a crap season, and you make bucket loads of money.
Yeah.
Because if you have a good season when everyone else is having a good season, then the prices all get forced down, and so you basically it's a relative game. You want to do you want to see other regions in the world do worse than your region.
Yeah. Now this was a very good one from Cookie Boy. This is talking about producer price inflation, so the input price inflation, right? Everyone seems to be experiencing, and of course the latest statistics from the US also was high too. And I think it's worth just thinking about this bit, because all of those inputs, so the cost of fuel and electricity are input costs, the other producer prices are inflationary, and then it all flows through. It's one of the reasons why my hypothesis is that inflation ain't going away anytime soon, because the producer price inflation is still extremely strong.
Yeah, and the trick of obviously is how much that translates back to the consumer inflation. So producer prices, say in China, have been sort of running at sort of 10, 15% levels, but CPI has been running at sort of 1 and 2% levels, like very low levels, because they haven't had as much demand internally, and so it's a key question for these in terms of saying this is where we're going to see whether the Fed's successful or not. And I think this is the first place to be watching in terms of the Fed is in the end they're trying to squash a supply problem by using demand side tools. So they're trying to bring that demand levels down effectively to the level where we see oil prices and energy prices start to fall. So that's definitely the place to be watching. If that starts to become successful at that, that's where it'll flow through. If the Fed can't get on top of that, or are unwilling, I suppose, to get on top of it, they start slowing their rate rises and start getting worried about the whole thing, then absolutely that's where we can see prices keep going. I guess my take is I do think they'll get on top of it, and they'll just keep going until they squash demand enough. And I think we will see some freeing up supply chains as well at the same time. I guess the big concern though for that, and the thing that worries me the most is that we're seeing all these energy prices boom while we've had shutdowns throughout China. So as China's reopening now, energy will pick up, energy demand there will pick up. There'll be more transport, there'll be more use of oil and all that sort of stuff. And we really didn't see much of a slowdown while China was shut down. Things could get worse before they get better. I guess this is a concern.
Yeah. And, the Fed has basically said we're definitely going to lift rates, and we're going to lift them quite chunkily to start with, and maybe a little gentler later to see how it translates through. New Zealand, of course, lifted rates. They're now at 2%. They lifted them 50 basis points the other day. And in New Zealand, house prices already started to slide back. Lending has fallen off a cliff. And people are now saying, "Oh, hang on a moment, it's looking a bit wobbly." But Adrian Orr the other day said, "We've got to do it. We've got to get through that inflation, because if we don't tame inflation, then everything else just falls apart." So the inflation objective does seem to be the number one objective amongst central banks. In the UK, they've done it too. We've got the RBA next Tuesday, as people are saying, maybe 40 basis points or maybe less than that. So it looks as though we're being a bit more gentle here.
Yeah. And an RBA review on the way. So, I guess that's, that you'd think that it'd probably bias them towards more action rather than inaction. I guess one of the things, I guess, from the RBA though as well, just thinking like, say, the US versus Australia, which is a bit more extreme, I guess, in terms of the way they do interest rates, is that almost all the interest rates in the US are done on 30-year mortgages.
Yep.
They've already moved, so the 30-year mortgage rate is already up to sort of, I don't know if it's 5% now. Yeah. It's getting close.
Close to
that. But everyone else who already locked in on 30 years has got, you got 30 years to you're locked in at 2 or 3%. You're good to go. Whereas Australia, because of the floating rate, it comes through much faster, and so and other countries are more like Australia than they are the US. But it is worth noting that the RBA, when it raises or lowers interest rates, affects it for a lot more people instantly than the US does. So I think there's positives and negatives to that, but it should mean that we see the effects faster in Australia than what you might see in the US.
Yeah, well, we're certainly more leveraged. And we have more people on variable rates. Wayne Byers today was worrying about, talking about what happens when rates go up and banks need to be careful, et cetera, et cetera. I'd rather feel he's sort of shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted, but I guess we'll see down the track.
Yeah, well, and we spoke a little bit earlier is that it was only a year ago we had our central bank, exhorting people to go out and borrow, and they were going to keep rates low for 3 years. So it's I can see people who listened to the central bank and went out and did that. You would think have at least some right to feel a little bit hard done by.
I smell a class action.
Yeah, well, yeah, okay.
Let me just acknowledge Cookie's contribution. Thank you very much for that. Term deposit matured today from the Cookie Boy Bank. Thank you. I appreciate that. And Jason asked this question, which I think is going right ahead. Do you think we're about to head into an inflation feedback loop that leads to hyperinflation if things aren't controlled, if it is possible to control? And thanks very much for the super chat, Jason. It's appreciated. I mean, the theory that inflation on inflation, it just sort of powers on. That's what happened in the 70s. It took them a long, long time to get it under control, and I would argue that they didn't really do it by force of policy. It was sort of force of circumstance ultimately.
Yeah, I'm much less concerned about that. In that I am a renewable optimist in terms of the energy side. And I do, like, my numbers are basically saying, look, we've got 5 years-ish of tough times. But in that 5 to 10 year range, you can just see how if the build-up is going to happen the way it looks like it's going to happen, the conversion is going to be very quick, and that caps energy prices. And so the question is, can we get 5 more years of significant energy price rises? I don't think we can, because I think already at current levels, it is so attractive to switch to a battery plus solar panels. And in my view, that's, at that point, your battery plus solar panel it's not infinitely scalable, but it's pretty close. Like we can get as much energy as we want and store that. And so if we're already incentivized to that, now it's just a question about how fast can we build the mines to dig up the materials we need and then how fast can we build the factories to turn those materials into solar panels, and how fast can we build that and the lead time on the factories is sort of 6 to 12 months. The lead time on for both batteries and actually batteries are a little bit longer, more towards the 12 months plus, but on a lot of the solar ones, there's been cases where they're up and running within 6 months. So I think the speed there will be quite fast. It's the so there's some elements of it. It's the mining side about how to get the particularly the lithium and things like that. But there's technology alternatives and at current prices, all of a sudden all these technologies that were like, maybe it's a little bit expensive or whatever, are like, well, I don't care if lithium's going to be half the cost. If I can't get the lithium in time, it's still profitable for me to do it at this other technology that's double the cost of lithium. And so, so from that perspective, I don't see that we could have 5 years worth of rising prices. I guess that's where I'm coming from. And I do think there's a supply side effect. And the other thing is we're seeing these rising rates. I think we're going to put we already didn't have much wage pressure. You get a 1 or 2% rise in unemployment in the US, and I think all wage pressure starts to go away. And then that whole hyperinflation argument is, well, where's it coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll just remind you that the RBA's estimate on wages growth is no real wages growth until 2024, right? Based on what the numbers look like. This is based on the pre-election budget. And that's before all of these inflationary pressures bubbled through. So real wages growth, I think we'll be holding our breath for quite some time before we see it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the RBA has been a hopeless optimist in the past.
Absolutely.
So let's hope they've overcompensated. They're being pessimistic, but their history is if those numbers are probably optimistic.
Well, there's that wonderful chart which I won't show now, but it keeps it was this, and in fact, right?
That's right. It's always next year's going to be great. Oh no, it wasn't. Next year's going to be great. Oh, gee, it wasn't again.
As I keep saying, low wages actually wasn't a bug; it was a feature in the system. It was designed that way, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And the question is, have we changed that design? So we voted in a different government, obviously. You would think they would be more predisposed to having higher wages. They weren't really last time they were in. And so, I guess their current sort of position, or their position very much on most things, was we've got the Liberal position plus or minus 5%.
Yep.
That's not enough to suddenly drive a wages boom.
Particularly if migration is then also up to a bit as well.
Yeah. So, but I mean, I guess that's a question for you. I mean, and for viewers, is migration going to come back? We threw the borders open and said, "That's it. Come on, guys. We want as many as we can. We need to bring all these people in," and it hasn't happened so far.
Yeah. Interestingly, in New Zealand, they've actually now enhanced the migration offer for certain categories of people to be able to actually get permanent residency immediately.
Right.
Because they're so desperate to try and pull people in. So I'm starting to see this international competition for migrants, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Because everybody needs them.
Yeah, and sorry, I've got a mental blank on the guy who's the researcher. I think you've had him on here, who's written about the universities, Salvatore. Yeah, Salvatore, and he's sort of obviously his view was that Australia had basically had the cheapest education system out there, and that was where people are ending up. But now we've got competition in terms of Canada and the UK and others sort of out there pushing for those students as well. So so I guess that's I guess the hope for wages in there is that despite the fact we're throwing the borders open and said, hey guys, everyone come in, is that to sort of that changes in that education, but also changes in people, I think just worried about lockdowns and stuff like that. And so not wanting to shift halfway across the world to a country where they don't have any support when there could be lockdowns. So and
the whole travel disruption and the fact we're a long way from anywhere, I think, talking to people from the UK, they're really not comfortable now about coming down this part of the world.
Yeah. And you speak to anyone who's a student here and ended up in lockdowns without any government support, without any work, worried turning up at food banks. They've obviously haven't had a great experience of the whole thing, and are probably less inclined to stay in Australia. But also they're less inclined to tell friends, relatives, younger siblings, come and take the Australian education experience.
Absolutely. I wanted to pick up a couple of comments from David Sutton, very interesting comments. The first was relating to the inventory. So, there was supply chain issues. A lot of companies in the US stocked up on inventory, and suddenly now they're marking those goods down because basically the momentum's gone out of the of demand. And in fact, the latest statistics from the US on retail weren't bad, but there's definitely an easing back, partly because of the same events as elsewhere. But his other point was, are we actually seeing the tail of inflation? Is the next stop going to be deflationary depression, right? And that's an important, I suppose that's sort of the Harry Dent type of prediction, as Stripey Cat said, right? But there is an argument that if momentum eases and credit turns negative, so people borrow less, and you turn the taps and you put interest rates up, you could lead yourself into a depressionary doom loop.
Absolutely, and that is the biggest risk we're facing from an investment point of view right now. I am very open to the idea that will happen, and that the Fed will push rates too high. They'll roll at exactly the wrong time. We'll start to see energy prices cap out at the levels they're and certainly so that they're at the stage where they're not rising anymore, and potentially we've got some demand disruption. Supply chains are starting to open up. More factories are being built on in local areas, and more automation, and you just end up in this whole spit. The question is when that occurs. Yes. Are we talking about? Is it 3 months away? Is it 3 years away? And I feel like that's somewhere in that range. And if it lasts for a bit longer, and you get the shutdowns we're seeing in China keep rolling because they're not on top of COVID. I was talking to you a little bit earlier, just saying that I feel like they're getting out of lockdowns, but I feel like they're the lockdowns Melbourne was getting out of at the start of the thing, where you're like, okay, we're out, but we get a few more cases and then we're back in again. Like we're not at the stage where we're vaccinated and we've got, a commitment to opening up regardless of what's happening. And so if those things keep happening, then maybe this can extend for a bit longer. But I do think the longer it extends, the more chance we have of a Fed mistake. So So whereas if it flips early, then maybe the Fed will pause early, and they won't end up making a big mistake with it. So I don't know. Is unfortunately the thing, but it is the number one question is to be watching is will that, or when do we see the downside of that? That's the whole supply chain, because absolutely right. On the other side of it, you could come sliding down very quickly. But at the moment, with disruptions in Russia, Ukraine, energy, China, it seems to be probably another 6 to 12 months. But it could be earlier.
Yeah. So, well, of course, Harry Dent's been calling it for around 20 years, right? But he keeps blaming the Fed for keep throwing more liquidity at it, and more liquidity and more liquidity.
Well, and for me, I do think if it wasn't for the Ukraine war, we'd already be sliding down the other side of it right now.
Yeah.
But what that's done to energy prices, and we're about to see, the second order effect of that hit. If energy prices double in Australia, I feel like energy prices are probably 3 or 5% of the average Australian budget. That adds 3 to 5% to inflation for a year.
Yep.
Even if it's just a one-off hit to a new price level.
Well, I make the point that those who are less well off, you're looking at 7 to 10%.
Yes, and then there'll be a second order effect of everyone will want to put up their prices because I'm paying more for this, and so now I want to put up my prices, and so we're getting really close to some really important inflection points.
Yeah.
And so...
and the other point, just to highlight, of course, as interest rates go up, the cost of debt goes up. So the idea of the free hit of getting really cheap money from by corporates or indeed governments, right, that goes out the window too.
Yeah.
Because the cost of debt requires a lot more cost of service.
Yeah, that's right. And it puts a little bit of a dent in some of this renewable energy stuff as well, because part of the real benefit of the renewable energy is you pay for it pretty much up front, and then you got it for free for the rest of your life, or very, very low cost for the rest of its economic life. And so when interest rates are 1% and 2%, all of a sudden the cost of putting it all up front is way cheaper. But as interest rates start to rise, that starts to push that out, which then holds your inflation higher for a little bit longer. So it's all part of that loop. And so I guess I've got ideas about where I think it's going, but I'd like to think that we're holding them as loosely as we ever have, in terms of just saying, look, we just need to be cognizant of there are a lot of titanic forces all coming together at the same time, and you get a shift in the wrong direction, and we could easily see some things move in a direction you weren't expecting.
Right. And talking about titanic shifts, I just want to put this one up. This is actually the iron ore fines price, right, which is sitting at about 139. It was up at a high of 220, and it came right down to 90. Then it's sort of swinging around there. Now, this for me is another important leading indicator of where things may go, because that's a supply-demand question. If prices are high, Australia does well. If prices are low, Australia does less well. And that's quite a lot of that is being driven, well, really by the demand from China, isn't it? Yeah.
Now, okay, so I've got a 100-year chart for that same one, or 120 years, and it's on a real basis. $50 is basically your long-term price. Most of the major producers would be happy to produce as much as possible at $50 or $60. That's not a big issue. So they're raking it in at the moment. But it's really interesting, that whole. So we've got this iron ore price that's up there. The world's biggest consumer of iron ore is the Chinese housing market.
Yep.
And that's crashing.
Yep.
On the flip side, so we've got they're trying to push a lot of infrastructure. They are building a bit of infrastructure, but nowhere near as much iron ore goes into infrastructure as what does buildings. Buildings is actually the high-rise buildings is actually the biggest user of iron ore. And so it's still I must admit, I'm a little mystified by the fact that it's held up as well as it has. Now, some of it might be financialization, in that there's people out there basically buying and building up stocks because they think that China's going to put on this massive construction boom. And China might change them, they might flip around. But when you look at the amount of empty apartments, the amount of waste they've already done, and the amount of discussion internally about the waste, I haven't seen signs yet that they're about to switch the property market back on. There will be infrastructure spend, but the infrastructure is just not enough to offset it. So that's one where, if something happened over the next, I don't know, six weeks, and we found out there's all these extra inventories that were being built up elsewhere, and China had just come out and said, no, we're definitely not switching on the property. And could you see that fall back to $70-$80? Absolutely. I wouldn't be surprised at all. But certainly something's holding it higher at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, they did cut rates in China, and they are doing other things to try and reinvigorate the property sector a little bit. Although whether it's enough is
1,001 small things trying to get that property sector.
Exactly. Yes, they're having difficulty starting the machine again, right?
Everything except let their property developers go out and rebuild these debt Ponzi's.
Yeah.
So that's the key one for me. If they flip the three red lines policy, and I haven't seen any sign that they're going to do that. That would be the key to say, okay, I've got that one wrong. iron ore is probably off to $200 again, and there's another boom happening.
Yeah, and there's a political overlay there. November, I think, is when it is, right, where Xi and Li, what's going to happen there in terms of how that power play is going to come out.
Yeah. So what was it? There was a call. I can't remember what they called it, the 10,000 public servants call or whatever, something. That's not the right word, but it's something like that. That they had just recently, where so Lee was basically out there telling people, you got to get out and spend more money, and got to keep the economies going. On the flip side, we've got Xi out there telling people, hey, COVID zero is pretty key, and yes, we want you to go out and spend more money, but we're not changing the housing market, and so what that means is that if you're an official you're a local government official, you might have sold $1 billion worth of property last year. This year you've sold $500 million worth of property, so you're half down. You've got one of your leaders telling you, get out there and spend more money, despite the fact you've only got $500 million, and you took that whole $1 billion and put it into infrastructure. They're saying, now we want you to build $1.2 billion worth of infrastructure this year. And you're like, well, I've got half as much money, so I'm going to borrow it. If I borrow it and I go broke, they're sending me to jail. Oh, well, if I'm lucky, it's going to jail. I could get shot. Yeah. So I don't want to do that. Then I've got one guy telling me get out and spend more money and expand, and I've got another guy telling me lock down, make sure everyone doesn't get COVID. Yep. So they're frozen.
Yep.
And their problem is, there's I think there's something out the other day sending a bunch of them to jail because they'd been falsifying the numbers. Yep. With the whole view about going, well, if I tell that guy I am doing the amount of sales that I'm doing, but I just don't do it, so then I've solved all my problems. But now it's tough. It is tough.
And there's a whole bunch of cross-collateralization issues with some of the government entities too, right? Is another overlay of complexity.
Yeah, so I mean, there were the parts where they were lending money to effectively their own entities to buy the property, buy their own property back.
Exactly.
From them.
Yeah.
And so that was getting shut down as well.
Correct.
And so, it's it's very pro-cyclical, as we spoke about in the past.
Yep.
You sell property, you take that property, you go and build infrastructure with it, you then recycle those profits. And now we're in the reverse, and it's pro-cyclical in the other direction, and it is very hard to reverse it. My expectation is they won't be able to.
Yeah.
But yet to be one more of these titanic forces.
Yeah. No, it is, absolutely. And Cookie Boy just threw this question in. If commodity prices crash, what does that mean for the Aussie dollar? In fact, there's a broader question, about the Aussie dollar, because there was an interesting report the other day from the RBA basically saying, well, now we're going to start quantitative tightening, and quantitative tightening, we're going to be more relaxed about the exchange rate. So there's an interesting question about the Aussie exchange rate and how that plays out, and this is all part of it.
Yeah. So, if commodity prices crash, the Aussie dollar is probably crashing as well. The interesting part is you showed the interest rate rise as expected. Australia is basically at the top of the world, so our interest rates are expected to rise more than basically anywhere else.
Yep.
So that's what's priced in today. If that starts to become less, and if commodity prices start crashing, then people are going to go, well, interest rates aren't going to rise as much in Australia if commodity prices are crashing. And so therefore the interest rate expectations will go down below other countries at the same time as commodity prices are crashing. And so you'd expect to see the Aussie dollar come off quite strongly in that scenario. The flip side is, we're a huge energy exporter. Between coal and gas, there is bucket loads of money, and those prices are really, really, really high at the moment. Could we see a commodity crash? So it's a question about where it starts to slow down. Could I see a commodity crash in a lot of the metals and things like that coming because China's slowing and other factors are, but not as much of a crash in energy prices because we've got the whole Russia-Ukraine thing going on and Europe trying to basically go as fast as possible. I think in a way that it's almost as if they've gone, we'll accept prices of this high for gas, and then we'll just try and convert as fast as possible at that gas price. So could I see some of Australia's energy exports holding up for longer? Yep, absolutely. I hope that's not the case. I hope they, you see, if the Fed's going to do this, it may as well push it as far to actually crash some of these energy prices, which I think it probably will need to do. But could I see energy being the last one to fall? Yeah, absolutely. And that would hold the Aussie dollar potentially a little bit higher for a little bit longer.
Absolutely. But your point about the differential between the Australian and US yield curves, very interesting, right? We're definitely taking a slightly different tack.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's I've been as surprised as anyone that we've got, but I can see where I think the simple view is that, hey, Australia produces a lot of the stuff that the Ukraine does. It also produces a lot of the stuff that Russia does. And so therefore Australia is a net beneficiary of the whole scenario. So yeah, we'll make more from our agriculture imports. We'll make more from our coal, our oil and gas. And so therefore Aussie dollar goes up and interest rates in Australia will have to go much, much higher. Is the sort of simple view. I think that once you start to scratch away at some of those assumptions, that's where and just looking at how indebted we are and all these other factors, I think that's where it all kind of got stuck. But I guess that's what makes a market.
Absolutely. And talking making the market, let me just show you. This is WTI at the moment, so it's at 118.66 and still rising. Brent crude is even higher. And that sort of prompts Cookie Boy to ask the question about where oil prices are going. JP Morgan's calling it 250. Others are talking well above 200. Significant consequences if it gets that high.
Yeah. And what's interesting as well at the moment is the crack spreads, which is the price to turn your energy into your oil into petrol, are extremely high as well. So arguably on a crack spread basis, if crack spreads were a more normal level and oil prices were $150, then you'd get petrol prices about where they are at the moment. I guess is the thought is we're actually already seeing because of that. Yeah, because of the extra profit that's being made by the refiners in there, it's held up surprisingly well, especially in terms of this is while China's in lockdown. Not all of it, but but transport within China has been I don't know if it's half of what it was, but it's certainly well down on its highs or its typical levels. So it does say that there's some potential short-term price spikes for oil, and oil's not that it's not that sensitive in terms of the supply and demand. And so to balance the market, sometimes you need some really, really big moves to actually so could it shoot up to $250? Look, absolutely under the right scenario. I think there's it's not quite as bad as the energy side in terms of sowing the seeds of its own demise, but it's not far off. And I do think there's that that whole electrification argument. It's probably going to take a bit of a dent for in the short term because, yes, we've got really high energy prices, but we've also got really high electricity prices. But I think the impetus of we want to get off Russian oil, how do we get off Russian oil? We want to convert to EVs. I think you're going to see Europe go through that similar types of process. How do we produce more EVs? How do we do it faster? How do we get off, what's the fastest way to get off? And that will mean producing more and more cars. And that's the same snowball effect. You produce 2% more cars this year, there'll be 4% more the year after, and 8% before you know it. you're making some massive inroads into those fuel costs. But fuel costs could absolutely be a major issue for many countries, Australia included.
And a couple of people were also asking about the old gold, right? And it's interesting just looking, gold is at the moment 1849. Gold isn't doing what gold normally does as a sort of a safe haven, so many people are saying. And why is that? And, what's the story? Is it manipulation? Is it that it's lost its glimmer, or is something else going on?
Well, I mean, the first thing to go is you want to know to have a positive view on gold. You need to acknowledge there's other investors really that's going to buy it, and central banks and governments. Is there a need for, I guess, if you've got the view that other investors are going to be if you've got the view that other investors are going to be buying it, it's a front-running story in terms of that. Yes. I think it's worth thinking about it a little bit like a currency as well, in terms of being, an alternative to the Aussie dollar, to the US dollar in terms of currency. The US dollar has been very strong, and so that's typically means that gold is less strong. I think gold in lots of other currencies probably has been pretty decent, a lot more decent than what it's looked like in the US dollar. What else can I say? I think there probably is your next generation of gold buffs are out buying Bitcoin rather than buying gold, and so there probably is a certain element of the type of person you would, because you're basically thinking, what are other investors doing? The other investors that would have been coming through, your 18 to 30-year-olds are not out there buying gold. They're out buying different versions of cryptos. So, I think that's another element. And then, but I'd be looking, probably US dollar is probably your major one. And the US dollar for mine is still looks like, probably the strongest currency out there. It looks like their central bank's going to be more aggressive than others. They've got much lower energy costs there still in the US relative to Europe, and certainly the economy looks a lot stronger than what you find in China. So I think still, if you're taking a gold view as being an alternative to the US dollar, then the US dollar looks like it's pretty strong at the moment. It's my preferred holding over gold.
And there's the US dollar. I actually picked up the DXY just to show the overall, and it's still pretty. It went up to above 104, but it's still sitting at 102, which is damn strong, isn't it?
Yeah. So I mean, what's it put on there? 10% in, I don't know, 6 months, maybe a year. So yeah, it's been up quite dramatically, and that pullback. It'd be interesting. I mean, this is the part to say, if it's that it's pretty correlated with the stock markets is the other thing to remember on that. So that peak at 104 was basically as stock markets were bottoming.
Yep.
And then they've sort of risen back to the US dollar's fallen as markets have risen, and so you do have a very much an offsetting effect of those as well. So that's one as I'm investing, certainly very cognizant of that, is that the US dollar is acting as quite a good hedge on falling stock markets.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is very fascinating because it's one of the questions that keeps coming up. What about gold? What about gold? What about gold? Right, and I think the correlation between gold and the US dollar is the real critical linkage.
Yeah, I think. I mean, gold's lots of things, but I think as an alternative, I like to think that as an alternative currency to the US is one of its stronger drivers.
Now, I just want to briefly touch on the old Bitcoin story and the crypto in general, because, of course, Bitcoin has taken a bit of a bath. It's sitting at 31 at the moment, which is above 30. There was an interesting program yesterday on Four Corners talking about crypto, which was sort of okay, although it didn't, to me, shake the world in terms of insights. But what's your read here? Because some people are saying, "Oh no, this is the end of it." This is basically the death knells. Others are saying, "No, we've seen it before. We'll see it again." It does feel to me a little bit different this time, though.
Look, I think liquidity is a key thing to remember. Is that when we're talking about assets that don't have a fundamental backing to it, and when there's lots of liquidity sloshing around in markets, asset prices go up, and they end up, that liquidity's got to go somewhere, and so some of it ends up in esoteric things you've never heard of, and some people, probably both yourself and I, Martin, can't see that any fundamental value. Okay, but you got to recognise that this liquidity ends up somewhere. Yeah. At the moment, everyone's trying to pull back on liquidity. Yep. So we've got central banks everywhere trying to pull out liquidity. None of them are talking about turning it around and how can I flip it in. So under those circumstances, I find it hard to see how Bitcoin can rally strongly without that sort of flood of excess liquidity. I did notice I was on a program the other day, and the guy on before me was a Bitcoin expert, talking about how all these different things, and he was widely quoting Warren Buffett. So he was telling about why, you got to be fearful when everyone else is greedy, and you got to take Warren Buffett's thoughts to heart about now's the time to be greedy and getting out and buying Bitcoin. And I was sort of like, yeah, that might be one thing he said. I'm pretty sure he wasn't talking about Bitcoin at the time. If you want to start quoting Warren Buffett, he's a value investor. I don't think he has a lot of good views on Bitcoin. No. I think using him as a reason to buy. Yeah. I don't think he would approve of the message.
Well, the one thing about the Four Corners thing was they did make the point, which I think was a really important point, about the fact that Bitcoin is there's a small number of really big players. So in other words, we've got the corporatization of crypto land. So it isn't a lot of little individuals. There are huge, monolithic players who actually are influencing, distorting, whatever you want to say, to the market. That came through quite well, and I think that's a really important point for people to understand. This is not the idealism of 20 years ago or 15 or 10 years ago. This is something very different.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing to remember as well is we're in an energy crisis. Europe is thinking of as many ways as it possibly can to convert and get off Russian gas and get off Russian oil as fast as it can. Bitcoin is one of the world's largest users of electricity. Who knows what they'll do, but would I be ultra surprised if all of a sudden one of the EU's next policies was, okay, we're putting some sort of huge tax on crypto or something like that to try and bring down their energy usage and let them transfer off, rather than have to produce all that extra energy to do that. Maybe they could be using that energy to heat their houses and produce fertilizers at reasonable prices. Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting idea. Now, Jason threw this one in. Does Damien think that crypto is a better hedge than property now? Didn't Goldman Sachs recently say property is now not the choice of hedge in a portfolio? Aren't all markets being manipulated by the whales who have enough to affect the P&D on their own? Well, we know the whales can do that, absolutely.
Yeah. I would never use crypto and hedge all in the same sentence. Crypto is a gamble. If you want to gamble on it, gamble on it. But I definitely wouldn't think of it as a hedge.
Yeah, absolutely. The real issue is that if you try and actually use the same logic as other assets, you're missing the point, I think, about the fundamental difference between that and crypto. And I know that there are people trying to sort of give the sense that it's digital gold and, all these little shiny gold coins, but that's more marketing than anything else.
Well, and the marketing of about maybe a year ago was pretty, maybe 18 months even, where basically went from talking about crypto being an uncorrelated asset and using all these terminologies in terms of how it fits within a your classic CAPM model and all these ideas about it. And basically since all that came out, it's basically been correlated with markets. It's been just a high beta version of whatever the tech markets are doing. But So if that was the reason for people sort of putting it into portfolios, especially some institutional, if they're actually sold on that idea, now whatever logic they use to get it in there, they're going to have to come up with some other logic to keep it there because it no longer fits.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, if you look at the history of marketing, they've pretty much shaped it and morphed it right every way you like. And then the other thing to bear in mind is the central bank digital currency debate is really hotting up. The recent paper from the Federal Reserve, the work that's being done in Treasury and with the RBA here in Australia, work in the UK as well. We are going to see central bank digital currencies coming in over the top. And essentially, I would argue that the key volatility we've seen in crypto land is another very strong reason why central banks and why governments will want to push central bank digital currency, because they want to say, see, that's what if you don't let us do that, you're going to lose, you're going to lose your shirt. So they've actually got the perfect alibi now to put it in.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've seen, the Terra Luna, that blow up, and a lot of the things that are happening in these currencies are lessons that we have learned in the past. They're running into exactly the same problems that we've seen in currencies in the past, and that's why we created regulation. That's why we, all the things that crypto is trying to avoid. They're sort of learning the same lessons that everyone else learnt, and the answer was create a central bank and give it these special powers. So, which is not what crypto is about, and so if it ends up being we end up with central bank digital currencies.
And just to underscore, there's a difference between the crypto and the blockchain. The blockchain technology and the distributed ledger and all that sort of stuff, that can absolutely simplify transactions and make things happen a lot quicker and faster. That's different, though, from the manifestation of, say, Bitcoin, right? That's just one manifestation. And I think sometimes the two get a bit scrambled. So you can be a rabid supporter of the concept of the blockchain and how it could potentially transform finance and transform industry and payments without necessarily believing in the religion of Bitcoin.
Exactly. And, the ASX is busy trying to work on blockchain. I keep putting it off when it's going to come out. But, yes. But a lot of that stuff makes a lot of sense in terms of, I make the statement as, when I was working at fund managers and you'd look around the office and, there might be 100 people in the office and 50 or 60 of them were back office people who were basically just making sure the assets were where, that you'd bought this stock, has it been transferred correctly, is it sitting in the right names, all that type of stuff like that. You can definitely see the benefits of going, well, there's whatever it is, there's 40% of people who could no longer need to work if you had a much better way of keeping track of who owns what assets.
Well, imagine being able to transfer property, for example, at a push of a button rather than actually over 12 weeks of painful shenanigans, right? I mean,
that's right.
It is feasible.
I need to hire people for thousands of dollars to make sure that what I'm buying is in it, I actually own it, and all that type of stuff like that.
No, it is interesting. Well, look, we're coming towards the end of our show, but what I wanted to do finally was just to give you a little bit of chance to unpack a little bit of what you're thinking in terms of how the portfolios are shifting, right? Because there are lots of uncertainty at the moment. So presumably you've got on one hand to try and protect some of those uncertainties, but also you've got to take positions because you've got to be in the market. Yeah.
So look, I mean, we sold back at the start of the took off. We'd already underweight by the start of the year, but we took off a lot at the start of this year, which was timing's good in terms of that. So we've got lots of cash. We sort of built up a bit of a US dollar stake as well, and we do want to put that back out to work. But we spoke about all those titanic forces. Valuations have come back to a reasonable level, but worried about earnings still. The danger now is, I guess the biggest danger is that the Fed sort of flips and goes, you know what, everything is coming off much faster than what we thought. We'll trust in the fact that transitory will be transitory, and we'll hold it where we are. And we'll see it, and under that scenario, we could probably see markets sort of start to take off again, and a lot of the earnings not come through. So that's your bullish case. I don't think that's the most likely case. Your most bearish case is that we've seen the US Fed chief sort of style himself as a new Volcker, and looking upon this is his moment to show that they can be firm on inflation, and if they decide that's the case and they try and push things too far as everything's starting to roll over already, and they keep raising rates, then we could very easily end up in a depression. So that's your two extremes. The answer will probably be somewhere in the middle. My bet is it's probably closer to a fall first in terms of earnings. I guess I'm not expecting that they'll raise rates a few times and then go, okay, job done. They typically will raise rates until they've done too much, and then they'll start seeing the effects coming through, and the effects are lagged, and that's when they'll go, oh no, we've done too much, and they'll start trying to reverse at that point. And so that's my base case. But as I said, there's so many titanic forces sort of hitting all at the same time. Where China's the other major one we've got to be watching in terms of, do they flip and suddenly say, you know what, it's all too hard, let's just push the property sector and we'll deal with this same problem again in 2 or 3 years' time, which is, again, I don't think likely, but clearly possible. What else was there? I think bonds, we've started to roll a little bit more into bonds. I think it's time now to sort of recognise that they've pushed too far, and that there's some profits to be made. And so that's been nice a little bit the last couple of weeks to take back some of the pain we've sort of felt earlier on. But I think there's some more scope for bonds to pull back. They're probably highest conviction, but there's the least amount of profit to be made in that. The real story is, can you get the equity score right in terms of when equity markets are bottoming? But our thoughts are not yet.
So just to be clear, you're thinking that there's a bit of a peak coming, but it's not really going to be very sustainable. It will come back further before we find a firmer footing.
Yeah, I'm expecting earnings to be the next one to hit. Yep. So earnings have still been pretty strong. Earnings have been decent still. So I'm expecting that the Fed will keep raising rates. We'll see earnings start to get hit. At that point, markets will probably freak out a little bit, because that's the it's one thing to be paying like an average return when earnings are looking all right. But if earnings start to look like they might fall 10%, then markets will pretty quickly price that in. And depending upon how aggressive the Fed is. Actually, sorry, not even depending on the Fed. At that stage, we'll be starting to buy, and then waiting for the Fed to give us the key signs to, like, okay, they're easing up, and that's the bigger sign to jump in sort of both boots. But I think, if markets, in terms of a valuation sense, if markets fell on a valuation sense another 10 to 15%, I'd be certainly starting to nibble away at the edges. I'm already trying to find stocks that I think have been sort of hit too hard, and sort of some of the higher quality growth names that I like, and sort of start to pick up on some of those stocks and put them into the portfolio at more reasonable prices than what you're going to get. Well, certainly than what you could paid last year, and hopefully what we're paying in a few years' time.
Yeah, and just before we close, of course, the techs had a particular bad run. So if you look at the Nasdaq, that's down a lot further than the S&P 500 or the or the Australian, right? So do you think that was because they were just overdone because of COVID, or do you think it's to do with the interest rate differential now?
Look, there was a lot of stocks in there that were just overpriced in terms of the expectations, and this is always a problem with a growth stock. Is people find stocks. And the one my favourite is Cisco as an example. So Cisco, during the tech boom, people had identified that, and the tech boom in terms of the 2000 tech boom, not our most recent one, had identified that basically here's this stock that's going to be the foundation of the internet. They do the greatest routers and switches and all that type of stuff. And this company's going to be, the backbone of the internet. And they were right. Like, the profits in that company rose, just doubled over the 2000 to 2020, doubled and doubled again, and great profit growth. The share price went backwards over that time frame because it just got priced in that this thing was going to be the greatest thing ever. And so, and it turned out to just be a very good company. And that's always the risk with growth stocks is that, am I paying for the greatest thing ever when it's just happens to be a very good company? And so, maybe a stock like a Tesla might be an example of one where is it worth more than every other car maker on the planet? My expectation is no, there are other car makers that are actually worth something, and that Tesla's not doesn't have such a special source that it's worth more than every other car maker. And so it's really that question about how much am I paying for it? And I think the tech sector generally, there's a mix of stocks within the tech sector, and some of them were just priced at levels that you basically look through the Cathie Wood portfolio, and a lot of the story stocks that had these fantastic stories, but they were just priced at 200 or 300 times earnings
and no revenue.
And yeah, that's right. So, whereas there's some other stocks in there, your Microsofts and Googles and Facebooks and a few others like that they got a little bit expensive, sort of 25 to 30 times earnings, but not horrendously expensive. They're relative to and certainly given the growth that you've seen out of those stocks. And so, they're the types of ones that haven't come down anywhere near as far as the real high flyers. It's sort of gone from trading on 300 times earnings to trading on 50 times earnings, and so that's been a dramatic drop in price, and arguably for some of those are still expensive at current levels. So.
And the last question for tonight, which is the one that Cookies just put up as well, was I was going to say, new government, here in Australia, has it really made much difference in terms of your portfolio, your strategies, et cetera, or is it the same old?
No, I think our basically we went through and did our podcast on the differences, and the net effect really was that there's not a lot of different policy difference between the two. The real key thing to watch now for this government is what are they going to do about gas prices? There is a very simple mechanism to get gas prices down. Coal prices would make a difference as well. That'll be a bit harder, but that's where they can have the most effect in the shortest amount of time. I don't have high expectations, unfortunately. But,
no, indeed. No.
Let's hope they surprise us. Yeah.
It would be nice if it did. Well, Damien, thank you very much for your time tonight. Really interesting conversation. And we should just say that if anybody wants more information about what you do, there's Walk the World, which is essentially the fund that you run through Nucleus Wealth. And people can go across to the Walk the World universe and have a look at that and see whether some very interesting and easily accessible tools. And one of the most transparent systems and processes in any of the superannuation entities operating at the moment, which is why I think it's worth a look.
Absolutely, and the chance for you to tailor it to however you like. For you can move sectors or ESG themes or whatever in and out of your portfolio as you see fit. So the idea is that we sort of run the larger portfolio, but if you decide that regardless of the prices, you don't want any carbon stuff in your portfolio, then you can knock that out, or you don't want Aussie banks or whatever it is, you can sort of knock that out of your portfolio yourself. Yeah. So it's run for you, not sort of a broad-based one that everyone gets the same.
Yeah, and I think that tailoring, the customization, the transparency. And the concept, the Nucleus concept, it's the foundational element within your portfolio. You can still go off and do sporty things around the side if you want, but this is where the core foundation of investment over the long term should be. Absolutely, yeah. So all just blue chip stocks, government bonds, cash, and blue chip. When I say blue chip stocks, international and Australia, just large cap Australian stocks, international. Terrific. Well, thank you very much. Your voice held up, which was great. And I hope that by next time we chat in a month's time, you'll be completely clear of it. So, and by then the markets will be different again. Oh, absolutely. But I do feel as if the difference between this month and last month has probably been the least amount of change we've seen in the last few despite months. The election, you're right. The trajectory is still somewhat similar, isn't it? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. It's sort of been relatively stable, but yeah.
anyway, we'll see how we go in another month's time.
Great. Thanks, Damien. I'll take you offline now. Have a good evening, and we'll talk in a month's time.
Sounds good.
See ya. So there you go, folks. Hope they found that useful. Very interesting conversation. Always worth just understanding some of his thinking. Very, very insightful, I think. And just to say before I close that next week, I've got Chris Bates coming on. He's going to talk with me about the property sector, particularly, of course, from a mortgage broker perspective. Lots changed in the last month or two. So mark your diary for that one. And it'll be an interesting conversation. Meantime, obviously, we'll be putting out shows every day as normal. So go and check those out. And do feel free to come back and see us again next Tuesday. And I really appreciate your time with us tonight. Thank you very much for all the comments, all the super chats. And we look forward to seeing you next week. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.